Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely. With me today, of course, is co-founder of the Gaggle, Peter Lavelle, host also of RT's talk show, Crosstalk. Well, Peter, today we are inaugurating a new series. We've got lots of new series, but this one is a new one, and we're really excited about it. It's the Gaggle Q&A, in which we tackle some of the questions that Gagglers have posed for us. There's so many questions to choose from, so we're only able to answer a few of them. Any that we haven't been able to answer, we're not going to be able to answer today. We're going to answer in the future. So I'll start off with with a question that here's something. It says, Peter, you've lived in Moscow for 20 years. You arrived at the time when Russia was just starting to emerge from catastrophic decline. What are the most striking changes in Moscow and in Russia more generally between then and now that you've noticed overall, as well as those that have impacted your life personally? And to me, it says, from my somewhat limited understanding, Hungary was one of the more functional Warsaw Pact nations. Is there a nostalgia in Hungary for life under the old communist regime, similar to that in Germany for some aspects of the life in the GDR? All right, Peter, you want to start off with answering?
Yeah, I think the way I'll start off is that I think there's what's called red nostalgia. I think, George, you and I should do a separate video on that, because I think it's a very interesting topic. An article in the American Conservative a couple of days ago addressed it as well. What are the biggest changes? The country's gotten much wealthier. The development of a middle class values, at least from my boomer generation, middle class values. Moscow has become amazingly modernized. Everybody does everything on this now, virtually everything. I pay all my bills that way, everything. Just much more organization, and you know, the world loves to talk about Putin and Russia and like Ukraine and all that. The vast majority of the people's time inside of Russia is talking about inside the country, how the country is being developed, and if the authorities are responding to their demands and needs. And slowly but surely, the authorities are. So when I first came here, people would say the same thing to me over and over again. We just want to be a normal place. Well, it's very normal to the point of banal, actually, okay? I see around me in so many districts around Moscow, amazing building projects, residential housing, which those of you that know the history of Russia, the Soviet Union, and post-Soviet Union, residential housing was always a really big problem. Now there's a huge excess of it, okay? But overall, just seeing the growth of a strong middle class, entrepreneurship, and pride in their country. There's no wokeism here. Russians have they have a lot of self-criticism of themselves and of their history, but nothing on the level that you see in Europe and in the United States. So a great sense of pride. At the end of the day, I just really like living here. Doesn't mean everybody's nice. Wherever you go, there are going to be people that are not pleasant, okay? But overall, it's a wonderful place to live. It's a conservative place, and I feel comfortable here.
All right. So to answer the question about Hungary, I don't see too much nostalgia for the communist times. People really don't look upon it very fondly. And remember, the communist era in Hungary, the post-1956 era, the Kádár era, really wasn't too bad. Obviously, there was no political freedom, but it was a fairly tolerant place. I mean, the Kádár attitude was, you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. I mean, so long as you don't make too many waves, you don't start going around criticizing the government, we'll leave you alone. We're not going to, spy on you and arrest you for whatever nonsense. And people were allowed to travel abroad and even take their families with them. I mean, that was quite a big deal. So even so, despite the fact that the Kadar regime was well, it was at a certain level, it was also kind of a mixed economy, that the famous expression, goulash communism. So it wasn't bad. So they allowed small businesses to flourish, and there was tolerance for the public. Even so, there is really very little nostalgia for that. People just don't like that. Now, that doesn't mean that the Hungarians are obsessively anti-communist. I mean, that's gone. They don't talk about that, and they don't really care about it. Which is why Orban's pro-Russian policy, or policy that's generally very business-like, pragmatic relationship that he has with Putin. He regularly visits Moscow. Putin has also several times come to Hungary. It's a business-like relationship that drives everybody else up the wall, particularly the Europeans. But Hungarians are perfectly happy with it because they think, we're getting good deals out of it. I mean, you get the good, it's sensible business deal. Now, which Hungarians aren't happy about it, that the very sort of the liberal Hungarians, the George Soros crowd, they fulminate against it. They fulminate about the Russian presence in Hungary, and they rage and think that Orban wants to sell the country out to the Russians. He wants to leave the EU and join the Eurasian Union and all this stuff. So they're obsessed about it. But the rest of the public, I think they're perfectly happy. I mean, if you can get some cheap gas from Russia, who's to say no? So no nostalgia for the Russians, no nostalgia for communism, but a very pragmatic attitude towards relations with Russia today.
I remember visiting Budapest in the late 80s, and of course I'd seen Prague, Bucharest, obviously Warsaw, because I lived in Poland. I saw all of these capitals, and the one that was the greatest and best by far was Budapest, because it was lit up at night. It was colorful. Goulash communism, socialist entrepreneurs was also the term that was often applied to Hungary. And I can remember. I mean, I was just a student, so I didn't have much money. But I remember you could very beautiful leather goods you could buy. It was really a lot of kind of folk art things that were really beautifully done. So I thought, I remember because I thought, if I'd had a choice between Poland and Hungary, I picked the wrong one, because this place was a lot nicer. And plus they still had that kind of Viennese, I think it's probably still there now, but in the 80s, they still had this Viennese tradition with coffee and things like that. And it was Art Deco was there, that was still there. So it was, for a communist country, it was a pretty good place to be.
It wasn't bad. And yeah, they really began turning it into a kind of a tourist center, tourist mecca. It's beautiful Central Europe, very inexpensive. And that was in the 70s and 80s. So you want a nice, cheap holiday. Hungary was a very nice location. And it's a kind of an interesting thing. I mean, because, remember, this was after the brutal suppression of the '56 uprising. So remember, in Poland, they managed to avoid the Soviet invasion. They switched power just in time, and they brought in Gomulka, and the Russians just let it go. The Hungarians, they didn't let it go, and the Russians moved in. So everything seemed very bleak for a while in Hungary. I mean, this was, with the Soviet tank. But under Kadar, all that sort of changed. And so I think while in Hungary things got a lot better, I think in Poland things got a lot worse. So, you wouldn't think that would happen in '56.
What's really interesting in retrospect, as an American, and the image, the idea of Europe, you found it in late communist Eastern Europe, because it was much more idyllic. There wasn't this huge drive to modernization. We have all these awful glass buildings and this soulless cityscapes. The Middle Europe, Europa. It was kind of Prague, Krakow, and Budapest, and it was in your mind, in my mind, it was idyllic, but it was a reality. It was a real place. Okay. Yeah. Once once the communist experiment ended in Eastern Europe, that all went out the window. And then it became a caricature of itself, of this idyllic Middle Europe, okay? But for a time, it really did exist, because you have to remember, after the war, they weren't modernizing, they were rebuilding, okay? You didn't have time to modernize, you had to get roofs over people's heads.
No, that's right. And I mean, if you look at Hungary, when I was there as a child, it looked a bleak place. I mean, the buildings were sort of very grim. You know, they still had bullet holes from from World War II and from '56. Then again in the '70s, they started cleaning the place up. You know, wash the buildings and get rid of the bullet holes. And then you could say, hey, this is a really beautiful European city. This is a nice place to hang out in. So
Baci Utsa, walking down the
exactly. But as you say, there's a kind of old world nostalgia. It's like, hey, wow, it's like almost I'm back at the turn of century Central Europe.
Because the first time I went to Europe, I was 20 years old, and I was going to study in Poland, in communist Poland, under martial law after the Solidarity trade union had been suppressed. So I land in Frankfurt, and George and Gagglers, I have to tell you, I was really disappointed, because I was looking around Frankfurt and said, this looks like Chicago in German. Okay, where's Germany? I feel like I'm in the Midwest.
Exactly. Yeah, Frankfurt. I mean, exactly. It could be Chicago. You could be almost anywhere, any town in the USA. Just this is the financial district, and that's it.
Yeah. But there is something to red nostalgia, and I want to talk to George about it at greater length, because I think it's a very interesting thing. It's not people that want something to come back, but a lot of people. They have, that's their memories of their childhood, okay? And their national identity. And it's still a very interesting concept. Let's go to the next question, but I think it's an important topic.
All right, so the next one kind of is I think tied to what we talked about just now, but I mean, still worth it. It's from Quantum Rome. And again, to Peter, what do you think about the discrepancy in the general public perception of the West on the part of ordinary Russians? It says, for instance, it's such a strange dichotomy. The rhetoric from the West continues to escalate, and Russian media reports it, yet the majority of the Russian people still seem to be oblivious to it, constantly expressing very warm feelings towards and keen interest in everything Western. So do you agree with that?
Not completely, but the gist of it, there's something to it. You have to understand, Western, particularly American cultural hegemony is very, very powerful in the world, extremely powerful. Netflix, for example, or they have, what's the other one? Netflix and HBO. HBO is here under another brand. It's called a Mediateca, but you can see all this stuff in Russian if you want, okay? And so there's still that allure. You have to understand what happened in Russia in the 1990s. This is how someone put it to me once, which I thought was really, really interesting. The day after the Soviet Union, so we were told all our lives we live in the greatest country in the world. And then when the Soviet Union fell, we were told we live in the worst country in the world ever. And so they have had to really kind of come to terms with that. And there was a reference, I think an erroneous one, I've always thought it was an erroneous one, was the West. And there are plenty of people, I mean, and one of the things I really disparage is that you have, particularly in the 90s and the early 2000s, and unfortunately it continues to this day, you have some of the wealthiest families in Russia, they send their kids to the UK to get a UK education. And this stresses me a lot, because you're basically giving the younger generation to be brought up in a different culture that venerates that culture as opposed to yours. Okay.
And I think that kind of goes back to something deeper, because I think it's, if you go back into, again, 19th century literature, where you have the kind of an inferiority complex that the Russians had with regard to the West, because they see the West, that's enlightenment, rational thought,
Wealth.
qualities, but on the other hand, you've got the the feeling that Russia does have something special to contribute. Its own history, its culture, its religion. So there's always that tension, and you very much see it in the writings of Dostoevsky, because he actually turned against the West, as opposed to those like Turgenev, who kind of still admired the West. So I think, but I think that's still present surely among the Russians. There's a certain kind of an inferiority complex. I mean, when you said that they send their children to schools in the West because they somehow want to be taught in Western ideas, Western values, Western way of doing things.
Well, I mean, and we have Solzhenitsyn as well. I mean, he was a dissident that was thrown out of the Soviet Union, and after living in the United States, he surprised them, shocked them by saying that he didn't think that the West was a solution. And as a matter of fact, and he was prescient. He was very prescient because people didn't understand what he was talking about. In retrospect, it was very clear what he was talking about. He was talking about Russia, not the Soviet Union, okay? He was taking the ideology out of it all. And thank God, because that was what mixed everything up and confused and muddied the waters. And he was, I think he was in Vermont, right? I mean, then he was beginning, and then he was basically, when Russia came up from the ashes of the Soviet Union, this is exactly what he was talking about. This is the resurrection that he was looking for, which we all, I mean, you, George, at least George and I were looking for.
He always said, when the Soviet Union gets rid of the Bolsheviks, I will return. And he was as good as his word. When the communists departed, he returned to Russia, and by then he of course became a kind of a national icon. But what you said is exactly right. I mean, but I think he probably also identified Bolshevism as having Western roots. It was a kind of a Western import onto Russia, which is why it was such an
absolutely. Marxism is a Western ideology, and it was grafted on in the most horrific way in the Soviet Union. When during the Cold War, they talked about captive nations. Russia was the biggest captive nation of that ideology, and that is verboten to say. Verboten to say around Atlantic Council people. Okay.
No,
okay.
That's right.
So, but I think there's, to kind of finish up on this question, I think there's a balance coming into force here because Russians are fanatics about tourism. This is why this COVID thing has driven a lot of people crazy because they love seeing the world. But George, what's important here? They go and see the world and then they come back. See, they come back. And to go back to the first question that we were asked, when I first came here, going to TIGF Fridays was considered a nice dining Fridays, which is awful, okay? Now, people have taste, real taste, okay? They know what's good, and what I like is that, and this is something I do in my own personal life, is I look at best practices. What are the best things you can find around the world, okay? And not one culture supplies everything, okay? You choose what is the best for you, and Russians do that. They have that chance now. They've never had that chance. They've only had that chance since the end of the Soviet Union. And so, they choose to spend their money, they choose where they want to go, and particularly in cuisine in Moscow, I mean, if the food isn't good and the service is bad, you're out of business. You're not guaranteed a survival. And this is something Russians have learned over the last, I would say, 20 years, okay? I have money, I want to spend it the way I want it, and if you don't provide a service, you're not going to get my business. That's a relatively new attitude here, and I think it's a healthy one.
All right. So let's go to the next one. Well, there's a question here. What does George think of Orban's chances to retain power in next year's elections? If the opposition wins,
Who asked the question, George? Who asked it?
Oh, yes. This is Danaki. Danaki was a regular Gaggler, and he contributes a great deal. So, if the opposition wins, will life take a turn for the worse, at least socially, with all the woke nonsense? Well, as things stand, the polls have the Orban and the opposition that's pretty even. Without question, the United States and the European Union and all the NGOs of the world are going to pile in, and the social media, everyone will pile in to get Orban out. I mean, Orban is a thorn in the side of all of the political media elites in the West. So they're going to try. The coalition, I mean, they put together this coalition of just about everybody but Orban to try to get him out. It's a little bit like the coalition they put together in Israel to get Netanyahu out. So you have all kinds of incongruous elements in it. So you've got far right, you've got far left, you've got kind of middle of the roaders, but everybody's into this coalition. We've got to get Orban out. It could, I mean, if I were a betting man, I'd say probably Orban will survive. But I've learned never to underestimate the color revolution influence. If they do come to power, I mean, I think that there will undoubtedly be a huge upsurge of wokeism, and everyone's going to pile in. All the Michael Ignatievs of the world, he head of the Central European Union. They're all going to pile in. This is their once in a lifetime opportunity to ram wokeism down the throat of the Hungarians. But I think also, and it's similar to what's happened in the United States, there will probably be a reckoning. I mean, they're going to use the justice system in order to go after Orban and the people around Orban and try to bring criminal charges against them. So it may not be a pretty sight, but there's no question it's going to be a ferocious battle. I mean, they have Orban is within their sights. He's he's like Lukashenko, but Lukashenko always has the Russians behind him. Orban doesn't have anyone behind him, so he's a much more of a vulnerable target.
George, I'll be looking for an apartment for you in Moscow if they allow mail-in voting. Okay.
Yes. All right, let's go on to the next question. Let's see. Oh, here's somebody from FIA. A very, very, very brief question. Thoughts on Pat Buchanan? Okay, Peter, what do you have? Do you have any thoughts on Pat Buchanan?
Absolutely, absolutely. Growing up, he was considered, well, first of all, he was a Nixon speechwriter, okay? And the way and this is pre-internet, the way he was portrayed is being like a segregationist, anti-civil rights, very much identified with the most conservative elements of the Republican Party and not the best elements, okay? And for a long time, and I remember we made his presidential run, how the media piled in on him. Wow, they piled in on him. But he was the first American firster, okay? He was, in my mind, okay? And then he started writing more and more about foreign policy. And I can remember in the early 2000s, like around 2005, I was saying, is this the Pat Buchanan I knew from the 80s, really? And I had a total tidal wave shift when it came to Pat Buchanan. I mean, I eagerly await his newsletters, and I think he writes one of the best ones out there. He never wastes a word. You can read it in like 3 minutes. You get the gist of it. Not like all these windbags out there that just repeat themselves over and over and over again. He has unique thoughts, and very, very rarely do I disagree with him. So I say 2 thumbs up to Pat Buchanan. Unfortunately, he's elderly. We're not going to have him for too much longer.
Right. I think, I endorse everything you said. Remember, he was almost the first. I mean, he was a rabid anti-communist. I mean, so, he also worked for Ronald Reagan. He was the speechwriter for Ronald Reagan during his second term. Very anti-communist, but he was really the first to see that the end of the Soviet Union meant that we have to rethink U.S. foreign policy. And he did it before everyone else. You know, it was way back already in 1991. He just said, "Okay, well, that's it." I mean,
and he was thrown out of the he was thrown out of the Republican Party for questioning it.
Exactly. So that really challenged the Republican Party orthodoxy. He also, of course, challenged Republican Party orthodoxy on the unwavering support for Israel, which, and then he again was subjected to the most ferocious attacks. I mean, if you think back to the 1992 campaign, which I think was the height of the anti-Buchanan, I mean, you know, it was what you saw against Trump, you know, you kind of saw in a kind of, you know, in an even more intense form against Pat Buchanan. Everyone just accused him of anti-Semitism. You know, Buchanan wasn't able to handle, I think, as well as Trump, because Trump just simply shrugs these things off. I mean, just walk up a duck's back. I mean, he doesn't care. That's how he operates. That, you know, everything that was thrown at him, Trump just shrugs off. I mean, I think Trump is a kind of unique person. I've never come across anyone in my life like Trump. Buchanan is a much more of a human being, and I think that these attacks, I think, hurt him, and I think he showed himself there to be vulnerable. But the 1992 campaign really blazed the trail for Trumpism a quarter of a century later, because that was the campaign of Pat Buchanan and Ross Perot, and they both raised the issues that Trump was to raise, which is ridiculous military spending, these terrible trade deficits, and, you know, as when Ross Perot talked about the great sucking sound, jobs being moved out of the United States, and immigration, of course, that was both Buchanan more than brought up the subject of immigration. So he really was far ahead of his time.
And that is the origins of the American conservative. Okay, he was one of the architects of it, because they took a anti-interventionist, anti-war position, which was breaking with the orthodoxies of the Republican Party at the time. Prescient, one of the most prescient people of our time.
Absolutely. Here's another short question. All right, Peter, do you think Putin would consider, this is from RSVP 6, do you think Putin would consider an interview with Tucker Carlson?
Of course, I think he would. You know, I have seen Vladimir Putin in person being interviewed by Western media. Some may be surprised by this, but I don't go to all of them now, okay? Because Western journalists ask questions for the sake of the question. They have no interest in the answer. Yeah. I think Vladimir Putin would talk to Tucker Carlson, because I think Tucker Carlson would ask interesting questions, and Putin would give him interesting answers. I think that's the reason why, as we've been told, the reason why they were eavesdropping on him. Yes. They don't want someone like Tucker Carlson to interview Putin. They want someone like Rachel Maddow, okay? Right. Okay, which will of course be how often do you beat your wife questions, one right after another. Okay, and Tucker Carlson would probably say, well, I mean, how do you respond to Western media coverage of yourself? And then just fold his arms and let him talk.
That's exactly it. I mean, you know, Putin is given these interviews. I mean, he gave one to Megyn Kelly. He's given one to Chris Wallace. He gave the long one to the Financial Times. And it's always along the lines of, why do you keep interfering in American elections? Why are you persecuting Navalny? Why don't you allow freedom of political organization in Russia? Always the kind of hostility. It's like, but as you say, they're not interested in the answer. It's like, already getting ready the next hostile question. And I think that Tucker Carlson would ask intelligent questions, and the American people would actually get an intelligent conversation with Putin. I mean, so you won't be just saying, no, we don't actually do that. No, that is not true, which is kind of a waste of time. Instead, Putin, I think, would give a very intelligent description of what happened since the end of the Cold War, all the problems of American policy towards Russia. And yeah, and people don't want, absolutely, the deep state does not want Putin to have that platform.
Well, I sat next to Vladimir Putin for over an hour. It was the 10th anniversary of RT, and we had moved into our new studios months before, and he was given a grand tour. I had a one-on-one. Okay, it was only 45 seconds, but I had a one-on-one with him for 45 seconds in my crosstalk studio. Then he was given a tour of the rest of the premises. Then our RT presenters and correspondents, we gathered in one of the studios, and I had the privilege to sit next to him. And we asked him questions, and he had no note cards. He listened to the questions and he answered them. There was nothing pre-planned about it, okay? And this is kind of a quick, funny story. I love telling it, but these are two university, you know what a blue book is, where you take your exam, right? So, so he had like what we would call a blue book, and then he had a pen. And so he would take a few, when the questions were being asked, he would write a few words to himself, okay? Particularly two of the RT correspondents kind of went on and on and on, which anyway, so my question was short. But when it was over, he stood up, he shook my hand. I was very pleased by that. And as he was turning away from me, I put my hand on his blue book, thinking, the ultimate souvenir. Well, I was wrong, because a man came up from past me, and he just gently lifted up my hand and he removed it and put it in his pocket. And I looked at the guy like this, like, don't blame me for trying. And he just smiled at me, okay?
Well, but the question I do have, why can't Tucker Carlson just approach the Kremlin directly for an interview? Why does he need intermediaries?
Maybe he, I mean, because other journalists, other news organizations have done that. Maybe he found a way to get right to Peskov or to Gromov. Those are his two major, or Zakharova, his three major press people. Maybe that was his route. I don't know. No. Okay, so, but I personally, obviously, I don't know the ultimate answer to this, but I think if the word got to Putin and Tucker Carlson would like to interview him, I think he'd probably say yes.
I think so. I mean, Tucker Carlson is now a known quantity in Russia. I mean, he was discussed in Solovyev's program, and they have a very positive view of him. One of the few voices in America they have a positive view of. So without question, I think Putin would say yes. But I don't. I guess I was just a little puzzled why you can't just go directly to the Kremlin, well, given his stature, in American media.
I wouldn't be surprised if Tucker had an announcement soon.
I would say. All right, let's see if we can do one quick one. All right, so let's see what we can do here. There's a question. What do you think about referendums? It seems to me, this is from Hawthorne Passage. Oh, that's a good name, Hawthorne Passage. What do you think about referendums? It seems to me that in Europe, we still haven't figured out how to fit them into constitutional democracies. And then I thought that Gina Miller had a point about needing to ratify Brexit through Parliament, and executives try to use them cynically to get around Parliament or as a political ploy. And some other European countries have held referendums and ignored the results. And then I'm thinking of a Dutch trade deal and this rerun of the Irish EU referendum. And it says, I live in Northern Ireland, and it's a little known fact that as part of the Good Friday Agreement, once a first referendum on reunification is held, there has to be one every 7 years until there is a vote in favor. Should we refrain from holding them and find a way to resolve those issues through party politics, or is there a constitutional place for them somehow? All right, well, I'll just say,
that's a good question. That's a really good question.
I mean, I just say briefly that when it comes to fundamental constitutional changes, you really need a referendum, and you need a huge majority for it. So 51% isn't going to cut it. I think you need to, okay, you want a big
60.
I'd say even more. I'd go at least 2/3. I think
Okay.
two-thirds, you get two-thirds because that means, because otherwise you get to, you know, what you had, you know, in places like Yugoslavia where you get 50%. Yeah, but that means you got 50% who are ferociously against it, and you're ramming down a fundamental change down the throats of 50%. So I think that's a very undesirable. You know, if you want Northern Ireland to rejoin Ireland, I think you're going to need, you know, at least two-thirds to go for it. But I think on the whole, Peter, that referendums are a good idea. I mean, I think it's great. I think that people should have a say on many things. I mean, I think the system whereby you have an election every 4 years, and then that's it. You have no say in anything else. It's all up to these elected politicians who make all sorts of promises. They don't fulfill their promises, and then they come back in 4 years' time, make all the same promises again, and you know, you don't have any choice in the matter. So I'm all for referendums.
I'm all for a referenda as well, because that means you have a commitment to democracy. And I think our ruling elites in the West do not have a strong commitment to democracy. Democracy for them is to codify and perpetuate the status quo, their status quo, okay? And so I'm all for it. I mean, and I was flabbergasted, particularly around Brexit, you know, when you have all these, you know, high-minded broadsheets, you know, enough of, we have too much democracy. There's too much democracy. Can you get that around your head? We have too much democracy, really?
No,
Really? When now in the United States, they're trying to nullify the voting rights of half the population. Okay, we don't have enough. We have too much democracy. Really?
Right.
No, the people that are against referendum are afraid of democracy.
Exactly.
If you believe in it, then practice it. Okay. And if you don't believe it, stop saying that you do. Okay. Stop your hypocrisy.
Right.
Because what they want is politics of apparat.
Yes. No, that's it. Because what happens, you know, a referendum is one of the few times people actually have get a direct say. You know, like the promising this referendum in Hungary. You know, now they'll have a say. Do you want what the EU is saying, which is we're going to decide education policy in Hungary, or do you want the what the Hungarian legislators have decreed about education in Hungary? People should have a say in the matter. I mean, who is Ursula von der Leyen to be laying down the law about, you know, what the European values are, and that, you know, who has to adhere to these European values? I mean, what's she been elected to? I mean, I don't remember any kind of, you know, anyone voting for her to be president of the European Commission. When did that election take place? So, I mean, this is the point. I mean, yeah, what these people, these creatures want is, you know, they just make these decrees, and then you have the sort of the formal kind of democratic process. You show up in 4 years' time, you make all these promises. People have no choice in the matter. You know, you've only got, you know, A or B. You know, it doesn't matter, you know, who you're going to put your vote for, and then that's it. You know, you have no further say in anything. So I think it's a referendum is largely gives people a say. And remember what happened with Brexit. Remember they said, oh, this is all ridiculous. The British will change their mind. You know, this is just a, you know, temporary will o' the wisp. You know, they thought this. Well, every single vote that took place after that referendum went exactly the same way. It didn't make, there was no shift. They didn't say, you know, in 2017, oh, we've had second thoughts on the matter. No, maybe we want to stay in the EU. Every single election since then went down the path of Brexit. So yeah, you know, finally people have had enough and say, no, you know, we don't want something.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we preach. Let's practice it, okay? And it's as simple as that. I mean, this whole thing, and I always mock it, you know, the EU, I mean, they only believe in referenda as long as they get the outcome they want, okay? Well, that's a reductionist position when it comes to democracy, okay? Don't be afraid of the people, okay? Don't. Because if you don't recognize what people want, the will of the people, you will regret it. You'll get this kind of political melees that we have, okay? Where parties are being frayed on both sides of the aisle, and we end up having this apparat decide everything for us, okay? That's not, no one ever voted for that.
No, exactly right. All right, Peter, that was our inaugural issue of the Gaggle Q&A. That was a lot of fun. Great questions. You know, it's very interesting. Hope you've enjoyed it. Peter?
Maybe I think we'll get a Gaggle Q&A tote bag out there.
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
Speaking of which, we're on Locals. So go to the gaggle.locals.com. We've set up a community right there. It's really a lot of fun interacting with you folks. We're doing one-on-one Zoom chats with Gagglers. As I mentioned, we have the store up. We did the first Q&A. And we're going to do live streaming very, very soon. And there's something about a jar I forgot.
And
George.
there is a tip jar, because that tip jar isn't going to fill itself. We're all hungrily eyeing it day after day. Luckily, Buddy's asleep because he's
yes, he is. Oh, there he is. He just woke up. Hey, Bud, that's right. You heard tip jar, and that's why who's messing with my tip jar?
Exactly. He takes more than his fair share, so we all need some of it. So, but seriously, we don't have billionaires bankrolling us, so any help that you can offer will be most appreciated. And remember, if you like the Gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. And say goodbye to Buddy. He'll be back asleep in no time. See you soon. Bye.